I accused my boyfriend of cheating. He was visiting his dead Marine brother's grave. I've been dating Ryan for 11 months. Recently, he mentioned his yearly California trip. Same dates every year. Wouldn't tell me why. Just said I could come if I wanted. I had work, so I declined. Days later, while he cooked dinner, his phone buzzed in the living room. A text from someone named Schwartz. Remember, Chelsea's favorite beer is Bud Light. Get a few cases. Chelsea, a girl's name. My stomach dropped. I'm ashamed, but I'd figured out his password months ago, the name of his favorite rifle. My ex cheated for 2 years while I trusted blindly, so when I saw that text, my paranoia exploded. Why would he buy some girl's favorite beer for a trip he wouldn't explain? My coworkers convinced me. Secret romantic getaway. He was cheating. I left work early, planning my confrontation. Found him in the backyard fixing our fence. Come inside, now. He dropped everything and ran in, probably thinking I was hurt. I know you're cheating on me. He actually chuckled, thinking I was joking. When I started crying, his face changed. He reached for me, but I swatted him away. What gave you that idea? I know about Chelsea. You're seeing her next week. Yeah, I am. Just admitted it. My heart shattered. I sobbed harder. Then he pulled out his wallet, showed me a photo. 2 Marines in full combat gear, arms around each other's shoulders, holding rifles. That's Chelsea. I recognized the other Marine from a memorial post, Ryan's battle buddy who killed himself 3 years ago. Chelsea was his nickname, his last name was Chelsea. I started apologizing frantically, but Ryan just stared at me with this expression I'd never seen. Not anger, something worse. His mom still lives in California, he said quietly. Every year on the anniversary, a few of us who served with him visit her. We bring Chelsea's favorite beer and sit in his mother's backyard telling stories about her son. It's the only day she smiles anymore. Ryan, I'm so sorry. You went through my phone. My ex. I know about your ex, but I'm not him. I've never given you a reason to doubt me. I know, I'm sorry. Chelsea saved my life. His voice cracked. Pushed me out of the way of an IED. Lost his leg. Came home, couldn't adjust, and he stopped. I visit his grave. I talk to his mom. I bring his favorite beer and tell him about my life. My girlfriend who I thought trusted me. Please, Ryan. I need some air. He left. I sat there crying, hating myself. An hour passed, 2. I texted, called, nothing. Then I heard his truck. He came back with a duffel bag, started packing. Where are you going? California, early. Can we talk about this? When I get back. Ryan, please. I can't look at you right now. You accused me of cheating while I was planning to visit my dead brother's grave. You made me explain Chelsea's death to justify myself. Do you understand how that feels? He left that night. For 3 days, nothing. No calls, no texts. I was destroying myself with guilt. Then, day 4, a text. We need to talk when I get back. Are you breaking up with me? No response. Day 5, his friend Jake called. Ryan asked me to check on you. Is he okay? He's processing. Look, Chelsea's mom, Maria, she's like his second mother. He talks about you constantly to her. He was planning to bring you this year, to introduce you to Chelsea's family. He had this whole thing planned. What thing? Jake went quiet. I shouldn't. He had something important planned for this trip. Before this happened. What was he planning? I can't, but you should know. Maria asked where you were. Ryan had to explain why you weren't there. She wasn't happy. My stomach twisted. What did she say? That maybe you weren't the one he described. That the girl he talked about would never. She told him to reconsider something. Reconsider what? I've said too much. He'll be back tomorrow. I didn't sleep. At 6 a.m., I heard his truck. He walked in looking exhausted, hollow. Ryan, I need to show you something. He pulled out his phone, showed me a video. It was him at a gravesite, Chelsea's grave. He was talking to the headstone, and I heard him say my name. This was supposed to be different, he said to the grave. I was going to bring her here. Introduce her to you properly. Ask for your blessing because you're the closest thing to a brother I had. I even brought the ring to show you first. Ring? The video continued. But she thinks I'm cheating. With you, man. If you were here, you'd laugh. Then you'd probably tell me what you always said. Trust is everything in a relationship. Without it, you have nothing. Ryan pocketed his phone and looked at me. Maria recorded that. Thought I should show you what you accused me of. You were going to propose? Was. He emphasized the past tense. Ryan. He held up a small velvet box. This was in my bag for California. I was going to ask Chelsea's mom for her blessing, then propose when I brought you next year. Was? My voice broke. I don't know anymore. I need time to think. He walked to our bedroom, stopped at the door. Oh, and Schwartz texted again while I was gone. You should see it. He tossed me his phone. The message read, Your girlfriend called me. Accused me of helping you cheat. Maria is devastated. We don't want her at the memorial next year. I sat alone in our house staring at Ryan's phone in my hands, reading Schwartz's text over and over until the words blurred. Maria was devastated. They didn't want me at the memorial. I'd hurt people I'd never even met, people who were already dealing with so much pain. My hands shook as I set the phone down on the coffee table and pulled my knees to my chest. Jake's voice kept playing in my head, how he'd said Ryan had something important planned, how Maria thought I wasn't the girl Ryan described. I'd destroyed everything. The house felt too quiet, too empty without Ryan's presence filling it. I grabbed my own phone and called him, my finger hovering over his name for a full minute before I pressed it. It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. He'd declined my call. I waited for the beep, my throat tight. Ryan, I'm so sorry. I know I messed up really bad. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, but please just talk to me. I love you. I need to explain. I need you to understand why I got so scared. Please call me back. I hung up and immediately wanted to call again, but stopped myself. The rest of the day dragged by in this awful slow motion, where I couldn't focus on anything except the silence from Ryan. I moved from room to room looking at all our stuff together, the photos on the walls, his jacket hanging by the door, the coffee mug he always used sitting in the sink. Every single thing reminded me of what I'd thrown away. I cried on the couch until my eyes were swollen and my head pounded, surrounded by the blankets we'd picked out together and the throw pillows I'd bought because they matched our furniture. The next morning, my alarm went off for work, and I just stared at the ceiling. There was no way I could go in and pretend to function like a normal person. I called my boss and told her I had a family emergency and needed a sick day. She didn't ask questions, just told me to feel better. I lay in bed for another hour before I finally forced myself to get up and check my phone. Nothing from Ryan. I opened my texts with Jake and typed out a message. Did Ryan say anything else about what he's thinking? Is he okay? I sent it and then spent the next 20 minutes watching my phone like it might explode. Jake finally responded. He needs space to process everything. You should respect that. My stomach dropped reading those words. Space meant he was thinking about leaving me. Space meant he was trying to figure out if I was worth the trouble. I texted back, I know, I just want to make sure he's okay. And Jake replied, he will be. Give him time. Time felt impossible when every minute without hearing from Ryan made me more certain I'd lost him forever. I spent the rest of the morning looking through photos on my phone, scrolling back through 11 months of us together. There were so many pictures of us smiling, laughing, doing normal couple stuff. Dinners out, hiking trips, lazy Sunday mornings. I found the photos from a few months back when Ryan first told me about Chelsea. He'd shown me the memorial bracelet he wore every day, a simple black band with Chelsea's name and date stamped on it. In the photo, Ryan was holding his wrist up to the camera, and I was next to him looking at it. I remembered that conversation now, how serious and sad Ryan had been talking about his friend. How he'd explained that Chelsea saved his life, and he wore the bracelet to honor that sacrifice. And I'd accused him of cheating. I'd made him think I believed he was dishonoring Chelsea's memory by using it as a cover story. The sick feeling in my stomach got worse, and I had to run to the bathroom. I knelt on the tile floor, dry heaving, my body rejecting the weight of what I'd done. When I finally stopped, I sat back against the wall and just cried, these horrible gut-wrenching sobs that made my whole body hurt. My phone buzzed with texts from my coworkers around lunchtime. They were asking if I was okay, if I was sick, what was going on. I stared at the messages for a long time before I finally decided to tell them the truth. I typed it all out in a group text. How the Chelsea text had been about Ryan's dead friend, not some other woman. How Ryan was a veteran visiting his battle buddy's grave. How I'd accused him of cheating during the worst week of his year. How he'd been planning to propose and now everything was ruined. The responses came fast. They all felt terrible. Sarah said she was so sorry for pushing me to confront him. Jessica said she felt sick that she'd convinced me he was cheating. Amanda said if she'd known the whole story, she never would have suggested a secret getaway. But their apologies didn't fix anything. They didn't undo what I'd said to Ryan or take back the pain I'd caused him. I told them I needed some time alone and muted the conversation. I didn't want to talk to anyone except Ryan, and he wasn't talking to me. I couldn't sit still anymore, so I started cleaning the house. I vacuumed every room, scrubbed the kitchen until it sparkled, organized the garage where Ryan kept his tools. I did all his chores, the ones he'd been meaning to get to but hadn't had time for. Fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom using a tutorial video. Cleaned out the gutters even though I was terrified of the latter. Washed his truck in the driveway and detailed the inside. It was pathetic, and I knew it. I knew a clean house didn't repair broken trust or make up for what I'd done. But I needed to do something. Needed to show him I was trying to be better even if he wasn't here to see it. I wanted him to come home to something good, some sign that I understood I'd messed up and was willing to work for us. By evening, the house looked better than it had in months, and I was exhausted, my muscles sore from all the physical work. But it felt good to be tired from something other than crying. That night, I tried to sleep in our bed, but I couldn't do it. The sheets smelled like Ryan, and the empty space next to me felt wrong and cold. I grabbed my pillow and went to the couch, curling up under the same blankets I'd cried in all day. I lay there in the dark and finally let myself really think about what I'd done. Not just the accusation, but all of it. I'd violated Ryan's privacy for months, going through his phone whenever he wasn't looking. I'd read his texts with Maria, with his military friends, with everyone. I'd invaded something private and personal because of my own issues. And then when I saw that one text about Chelsea, I'd jumped to the worst possible conclusion. I hadn't trusted him at all. I'd made him explain his dead brother's suicide just to defend himself against my paranoid accusations. I'd ruined what should have been a sacred trip to honor Chelsea, turned it into this awful thing where Ryan had to justify himself to his friend's mom. Maria had been excited to meet me, and instead she'd learned I was the girl who accused her son's best friend of cheating. The weight of it all pressed down on my chest until I couldn't breathe right. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to the sound of Ryan's truck in the driveway. The sky outside was just starting to get light, that gray dawn color. My heart stopped as I heard his keys in the door. I sat up fast, my hair a mess and my face puffy from crying. Ryan walked in and he looked awful. His eyes were red and tired, his clothes wrinkled like he'd been wearing them for days. When our eyes met across the room, I saw something in his face that made me want to die. Not anger. Something worse. Disappointment. Hurt. The look of someone who'd trusted completely and been betrayed. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there looking at me. Then his voice came out flat and distant. "We need to talk now." We moved to the kitchen table without speaking. I sat across from him and my hands were shaking, so bad I had to put them in my lap. Ryan looked down at the table for a minute before he started talking. "I spent the past 2 days at Maria's trying to figure out what I want." His voice was so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him. "She told me that Chelsea wouldn't want me with someone who doesn't trust me. That the girl I described to her over the past year wouldn't have done what you did." I felt tears starting again, but I forced them back. Maria had been disappointed in me. This woman I'd never met, who was already dealing with the worst pain a parent could face, and I'd disappointed her. Ryan kept going. "I told her about your ex, about the cheating, about why you got so paranoid. She said trauma is real, but it's not an excuse to hurt other people." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I finally found my voice, and it came out desperate and broken. "Ryan, I know I messed up. My ex cheated on me for 2 years, and I never saw it coming, and it messed me up really bad. When I saw that text about Chelsea, I just panicked, and all those feelings came back, and I couldn't think straight." Ryan held up his hand to stop me, and his jaw was tight. "I know about your ex. You told me all about him when we first started dating, but I'm not him. I've never given you a reason to doubt me. Never been secretive or suspicious. Never disappeared without explanation. Never gave you any sign that I was being unfaithful." His voice got louder. "And you still chose to violate my privacy and accuse me during the worst week of my year. The week I visit my dead brother's grave. The week his mother cries in my arms because she misses her son. That's when you decided I was cheating on you." I couldn't breathe for a second, staring at that ring. The diamond caught the morning light coming through the kitchen window, throwing little sparkles across the table. It was beautiful and simple, exactly what I would have wanted if I'd ever let myself imagine getting engaged. Ryan's voice was flat when he started talking again. He told me he'd been carrying that ring around for 3 months now. Every time we went somewhere nice, every time we had a good day together, he'd think about proposing, but he wanted to do it right. He wanted to bring me to California first, let me meet Maria properly, let me understand that whole part of his life before he asked me to marry him. He said Maria was like his second mom after Chelsea died, that she'd basically adopted all of Chelsea's military friends as her own sons. Ryan talked to her on the phone every week, told her about his life, about me, about how happy he was. He'd told her he found someone he wanted to spend his life with, and Maria had been so excited to meet me. That's why he'd invited me on this trip, why he'd been so disappointed when I said I had to work. He'd planned to introduce me to Maria and the other guys, let me see where Chelsea was buried, help me understand why that memorial trip mattered so much. Then next year, after I'd met everyone and understood the significance, he was going to propose at Chelsea's grave. He wanted Chelsea to be part of our beginning because Chelsea taught him what real love looked like, what it meant to sacrifice everything for someone else. Chelsea pushed him out of the way of that IED knowing he'd probably lose his leg or worse, and he did it anyway because that's what you do for your brother. Ryan wanted to ask Chelsea's blessing at the grave, wanted me to understand that Chelsea would always be part of our lives, part of our family. But now none of that could happen, because I'd ruined it. I watched him close the ring box with a soft click that sounded too loud in the quiet kitchen. His hands were shaking a little, and that made everything worse somehow, seeing him this upset. He looked at me and his eyes were red and tired. He said he didn't know if he could marry someone who didn't trust him, someone who'd been going through his phone in secret for months. His voice cracked when he said the worst part wasn't even the accusation about cheating. The worst part was knowing I'd been invading his privacy all this time, reading his messages with Maria and Jake and the other guys, looking through his photos and emails, and he never knew. He felt exposed now, like he couldn't have anything private anymore. Every conversation he'd had thinking it was just between him and a friend I'd probably read. Every text with Maria about his feelings or his grief or his plans for us, I'd seen without permission. He said it felt like a violation, like I'd been watching him through a window without him knowing. I was crying so hard I could barely see him anymore through my tears. I asked him what I could do to fix this, how I could make it right. Please, there had to be something I could do. Ryan shook his head slowly and said he didn't know if it could be fixed. Trust wasn't something you rebuilt overnight with apologies and promises. Even if we stayed together, this would always be between us now. This moment where I chose suspicion over faith in him, where I made him defend visiting his dead brother's grave, where I violated his privacy for months. Every time he went somewhere or talked to someone, he'd wonder if I trusted him or if I was checking his phone again. Every time he had a private conversation, he'd feel like I might be reading it later. He didn't want to live like that, always proving himself, always under suspicion. He stood up from the table and picked up the ring box, put it back in his pocket. He said he was going to stay at Jake's place for a while because he needed space to think clearly. Being in this house with me right now, looking at me, it was too hard. He needed time to figure out if he could get past this, if we could get past this. I begged him not to go, but he was already walking toward our bedroom. I followed him and watched him pull his duffel bag out of the closet, the same one he'd taken to California. He started packing clothes, moving around the room like I wasn't even there. I sat on the edge of our bed feeling frozen, unable to move or speak or do anything useful. He packed quickly, efficiently, like he'd done this 100 times before. Military training probably, knowing how to pack fast and light. When he zipped up the bag and slung it over his shoulder, he finally looked at me again. His face was so sad it made my chest hurt. He said he loved me, but he didn't know if love was enough when trust was gone. Then he walked out of the bedroom, out of the house, and I heard his truck start up in the driveway. I sat there on the bed listening to the sound of his engine fading away down the street. The house felt wrong without him, too quiet and too empty. I could see his coffee mug still on the kitchen counter from yesterday morning, his jacket hanging by the door, his boots lined up in the entryway. All these little pieces of him everywhere, but he wasn't here. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally got up and walked through the house touching his things like that would bring him back. I picked up his coffee mug and washed it even though it was already clean, hung his jacket more carefully on the hook, straightened his boots. Pathetic busy work to avoid thinking about what I'd done. Eventually I called my mom because I didn't know what else to do. She answered on the second ring and I just started crying before I could even say hello. She waited patiently while I sobbed into the phone, asking what was wrong, telling me to take my time. When I finally calmed down enough to talk, I told her everything. The text message about Chelsea, going through Ryan's phone, the accusation, California, the ring, all of it. I told her about Maria being upset and Ryan staying at Jake's, and how I'd destroyed the best relationship I'd ever had. My mom listened to the whole story without interrupting, which wasn't like her. Usually she jumped in with advice or questions, but this time she just let me talk. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me why I never dealt with my trust issues after my ex. Why did I bring all that baggage into a new relationship without working through it first? I started to defend myself, to explain about the cheating and the lies, but she stopped me. She said she knew what my ex did and it was terrible and wrong, but that was years ago now. I'd had time to get help, to process that trauma, to heal before getting serious with someone new. Instead, I just carried all that fear and suspicion forward and made Ryan pay for another man's crimes. That wasn't fair to Ryan, and it wasn't fair to me either, living in constant fear of being hurt again. She said I needed to see a therapist to work on my issues because this pattern would follow me into every relationship if I didn't address it. Even if Ryan forgave me, even if we got back together, I'd do this again unless I dealt with the root problem. She was gentle but honest about it, telling me that Ryan deserved better than being punished for something he didn't do. I needed to figure out why I sabotaged something good, why I couldn't let myself trust someone who'd never given me a reason to doubt him. We talked for almost an hour, and by the end I felt a little clearer, a little less panicked. My mom made me promise to find a therapist right away, not next month or when I felt ready, but this week. I agreed, and after we hung up, I Googled therapists in my area who specialized in relationship trauma. I found one with good reviews and availability later this week, called and left a message asking for an appointment. Then I texted Ryan to let him know I was getting help, that I'd made an appointment with a therapist. I stared at my phone waiting for his response, watching those 3 dots appear and disappear a few times. Finally, he texted back just 2 words. That's good. No emoji, no encouragement, no warmth. Just acknowledgement that he'd received my message. The distance in those 2 words made my chest ache worse than if he'd said nothing at all. Over the next few days, I went to work, but I was barely functional. I showed up on time and sat at my desk and went through the motions, but I couldn't focus on anything. My boss noticed I was distracted and upset during our team meeting when she had to repeat a question 3 times before I heard her. After the meeting, she called me into her office and asked if everything was okay. I didn't tell her details, but I said I was dealing with some relationship problems and I was in therapy now. She was understanding but warned me not to let it affect my performance long term. She said she knew personal issues happened, but I needed to find a way to manage them so my work didn't suffer. I promised I would do better and went back to my desk feeling even worse. My first therapy session arrived faster than I expected. I sat in the waiting room filling out intake forms about my mental health history and current symptoms. When the therapist called me back to her office, I felt nervous and exposed, like I was about to confess something terrible. She was nice, though, probably in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm voice. She asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I had to admit out loud that I violated Ryan's privacy repeatedly and destroyed his trust. Saying it to a stranger made it feel more real somehow, more awful. The therapist asked about my ex, and we started unpacking how that relationship left me with trauma I never processed. I told her about the 2 years of cheating, how I never suspected anything until I found messages on his phone, how stupid and blind I felt. She asked how I handled that breakup, and I realized I didn't really handle it at all. I just moved on, started dating again, tried to forget about it. I never dealt with the anger or the fear or the damage to my ability to trust people. She explained that what I was doing wasn't about Ryan at all. It was about my ex and what he did to me, and I'd been making Ryan pay for someone else's crimes. She said I needed to understand that checking his phone wasn't keeping me safe. It was destroying something good because I couldn't accept that not every man would hurt me the way I'd been hurt before. I left that session feeling raw and exposed, but also like I finally understood what I'd done. I hadn't been protecting myself from Ryan. I'd been attacking him with suspicion he never earned. I sat in my car in the parking lot and pulled out my phone. My hands shook as I typed out a message to Ryan asking if we could talk in person. I stared at the words for 5 minutes before hitting send. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, his response came through saying he could meet me at a coffee shop near Jake's apartment tomorrow afternoon. I texted back that I'd be there and spent the rest of the day anxious and terrified about what I would say. The next day, I got to the coffee shop 15 minutes early and sat at a corner table where I could see the door. When Ryan walked in, my chest tightened so hard I thought I might stop breathing. He looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping well, and there were dark circles under his eyes I'd never seen before. He spotted me and walked over slowly, and we just looked at each other for a moment before he sat down across from me. The distance between us felt massive, even though the table was small. We used to sit next to each other whenever we could, always touching somehow, and now we were positioned like strangers meeting for the first time. I started talking before I lost my nerve. I told him about therapy and what I was learning about my trauma responses. I explained that my therapist helped me see how I'd been treating him like he was guilty, just for being a man in my life after my ex destroyed my ability to trust. I apologized again, but this time I didn't make excuses or bring up my past as justification. I just owned what I did. I violated his privacy for months. I read his personal conversations with Maria and his military friends. I accused him of cheating during the most sacred week of his year. I made him explain Chelsea's death to defend himself. All of that was wrong regardless of what my ex did to me. Ryan listened without interrupting, and his expression didn't change much. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring at his coffee cup. Then he said he appreciated that I was getting help, and he could tell I was trying to understand what happened. But he was still processing everything, and he didn't know how to move past it. He said the hardest part wasn't even the accusation itself. It was knowing that for months I'd been going through his phone, reading private messages between him and Maria about Chelsea, seeing conversations with his military friends about their struggles and their grief. He felt exposed and violated in his own relationship. He said he thought he was sharing his life with me, but I was actually stealing pieces of it without his knowledge. I asked him if there was any chance he could forgive me eventually. My voice cracked when I said it because I was terrified of his answer. He rubbed his face with both hands and said he honestly didn't know. He needed to figure out if he could trust me again. If he could give me his phone password without wondering if I was checking up on him. If he could go to California next year without worrying that I'd accuse him of something. He said trust was the foundation of everything for him, because of what Chelsea taught him, and I'd broken that foundation completely. We sat there talking for over an hour, and it was painful but necessary. We covered everything from how I'd felt seeing that text from Schwartz to how he'd felt having to explain Chelsea's suicide while I accused him. We talked about what trust meant to both of us and how mine got destroyed by my ex, and how I'd then destroyed his. When we finally got up to leave, Ryan paused before walking to his truck. Then he stepped forward and hugged me briefly. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it was the first physical contact we'd had since he left, and I felt it in every part of my body. When he pulled away and walked to his truck, I got in my car and cried, so hard I had to wait 20 minutes before I could drive home. My next therapy session came 3 days later, and I told the therapist about the coffee shop meeting. She listened and then asked what I was doing to rebuild trust beyond just apologizing. I didn't have a good answer. She explained that trust gets rebuilt through consistent actions over time, not through words. I needed to show Ryan through my behavior that I'd changed, that I could respect his privacy and his boundaries, that I wouldn't let my trauma control my actions anymore. She gave me homework to think about concrete ways I could demonstrate change through my actions. I spent that whole week thinking about it, and finally I realized what I needed to do. I texted Ryan and told him I wanted to give him full access to my phone and all my accounts. I explained that I wanted him to feel secure and know that I had nothing to hide, that I was willing to be vulnerable the same way I'd demanded he be without even knowing it. His response came an hour later saying he'd think about it, but he appreciated the gesture. It wasn't much, but it was something. 2 weeks after Ryan left, my phone buzzed with a text from him asking if he could come by the house to get some more of his things. I said of course and asked what time. He said he'd come by around noon. I made sure to leave the house at 11:30 and didn't come back until after 2. I texted him when I left saying the door was unlocked and he could take whatever he needed. I wanted to show him I could respect his boundaries now, even though I'd failed so badly before. I wanted him to have privacy in what used to be our shared space. When I got home that afternoon, everything looked mostly the same, but I could tell he'd been there. Some of his clothes were gone from the closet. His favorite coffee mug was missing from the kitchen. Little pieces of him removed from our life. My phone buzzed, and it was Ryan texting to say thank you for giving him space. That simple message made me feel like maybe we were moving in the right direction. We started texting more regularly after that. The conversations were careful and surface level, mostly just checking in about work or asking how the other person was doing. But it was communication, and I was grateful for any connection to him right now. Every text felt like a small step towards something that might eventually look like trust again. My next therapy session was 3 days later, and I sat in the same chair I'd been sitting in for weeks now. The therapist asked me to dig deeper into why I jumped straight to cheating when I saw that text about Chelsea. I told her about my ex and the 2 years of lies, how he'd looked me in the eye and sworn he was faithful while sleeping with someone else the whole time. She nodded and wrote something down, then asked me what Ryan had done to make me suspicious. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out, because the truth was Ryan hadn't done anything. He'd been honest about having a yearly trip. He'd invited me to come along. He'd never hidden his phone or acted weird or given me any actual reason to doubt him. The therapist let that silence sit between us for a long minute before she spoke again. She explained that I'd been living in a state of waiting for betrayal instead of accepting that Ryan was a different person than my ex. I'd been treating Ryan like he was guilty before he'd done anything wrong, punishing him for crimes he didn't commit. I started crying because she was right, and I hated myself for it. I'd destroyed something good because I couldn't let go of something bad that happened years ago. The therapist handed me a tissue and gave me homework for the week. She told me to write down every single time I had an intrusive thought about Ryan being unfaithful, and then write down evidence against that thought. She said I needed to see my patterns, to recognize when my trauma was talking instead of reality. I left her office feeling exhausted and drove home to the empty house. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and started the assignment. I wrote down the Chelsea text and then forced myself to list everything that contradicted my fear. Ryan had invited me on the trip. He'd never hidden his phone before I went through it. He wore a memorial bracelet for Chelsea every single day. He'd told me about his military service and his friends who died. The evidence was overwhelming that Ryan had been honest, but my brain had twisted one text message into proof of cheating. Over the next 2 weeks, I filled pages with my intrusive thoughts and the reality that contradicted them. Ryan's late at work became Ryan texting me updates all evening. Ryan's quiet mood became Ryan processing grief about Chelsea. Ryan's privacy became Ryan deserving basic respect in a relationship. I started to see how irrational my fears had been, how I'd been creating problems that didn't exist because I was so scared of being blindsided again. 3 weeks after Ryan moved out, my phone buzzed with a text from him asking if we could have dinner together at a neutral restaurant. I stared at the message for a full minute before my hand stopped shaking enough to type yes. He suggested a place halfway between our house and Jake's apartment for Saturday night. I spent the entire week nervous and hopeful, playing out 1,000 different versions of how the dinner might go. I changed my outfit 4 times on Saturday before settling on jeans and a sweater, nothing too fancy but not sloppy either. I got to the restaurant 15 minutes early and sat in my car giving myself a pep talk. I wanted this to go well so badly, but I was scared of saying the wrong thing, of pushing too hard or not enough. When I finally walked inside, Ryan was already there at a corner table and my heart jumped when I saw him. He stood up when he saw me and we had this awkward moment where neither of us knew if we should hug or shake hands or just sit down. We ended up just sitting down. Ryan looked tired, but he smiled at me and asked how I'd been. I told him about therapy and the homework assignment, about tracking my intrusive thoughts and seeing how wrong they'd been. He listened and nodded, and I could see him processing everything I said. Then he told me he'd been doing his own thinking, and he'd been talking to Maria on the phone a lot. My stomach dropped when he mentioned her name because I knew she was still hurt and angry on his behalf. Ryan explained that Maria had told him she was disappointed in me, that the girl he'd described to her over the past year would never have done what I did. But then he said Maria also told him that Chelsea would want him to be happy, and if I was genuinely working on myself, then maybe there was a path forward. I felt this surge of hope that made my chest tight. Ryan said Maria had reminded him that Chelsea believed in second chances, that he'd made mistakes too during his service and Chelsea had never given up on him. I reached across the table without thinking, and Ryan let me take his hand for just a second before pulling back gently. Ryan told me he wasn't ready to move back in yet, and I nodded because I understood. But then he said he wanted to try dating again, like starting over but with the knowledge of what we both needed to work on. He needed to see consistent change from me over time, proof that I trusted him and wouldn't invade his privacy again. He needed to feel safe being vulnerable with me, and that was going to take months, not weeks. I told him I understood, and I would do whatever it took to earn his trust back. We talked for another hour about what that might look like, and we decided to have a standing weekly dinner date where we could talk honestly about how we were feeling and what we needed from each other. Ryan said he wanted clear communication this time, no letting resentments build up or assuming we knew what the other person was thinking. I agreed to all of it because I was so grateful he was even willing to try again. When we left the restaurant, Ryan walked me to my car and gave me a quick hug before getting in his truck. It wasn't much, but it was something, and I drove home feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Our first official date after the separation happened the following Saturday. Ryan picked me up at the house and it felt strange and sweet at the same time, like we were teenagers instead of adults who'd been living together. We went to a movie and then got coffee after, and the whole thing was awkward, but in a good way. We were both trying so hard to be present and honest with each other. Ryan told me about his week at work and about helping Jake fix his motorcycle. I told him about therapy and about a breakthrough I'd had about why I'd been so controlling with his phone. We didn't talk about California or Chelsea or the proposal. We just talked about normal everyday stuff, and it felt like we were learning each other again from a different angle. At the end of the night, Ryan kissed me on the cheek and said he'd had a good time. It wasn't the passionate reunion I'd been hoping for, but it was real and careful, and that mattered more. A month after everything fell apart, Ryan texted asking if he could come to one of my therapy sessions with me. I immediately said yes and texted my therapist to ask if she'd do a couples session. She agreed and scheduled us for the following Thursday. I was nervous about Ryan being in that space with me, about him hearing all the things I'd been working through. When Thursday came, we sat together on the couch in my therapist's office, and she asked us both what we wanted to get out of the session. Ryan spoke first and said he wanted to understand how to rebuild trust from both sides, Not just me proving myself, but him learning how to be vulnerable again. I said I wanted to make sure I was doing everything I could to show Ryan I'd changed. The therapist nodded and started asking us questions about our communication patterns and our boundaries and what we each needed to feel secure. Ryan admitted something during that session that broke my heart. He said he'd been struggling with feeling exposed and violated, like his privacy was never really his, even when we were happy together. He said knowing I'd been going through his phone for months made him question every conversation we'd had, wondering if I'd been checking up on him after each one. The therapist helped us talk through boundaries and what rebuilding trust looked like from both sides. She explained that I needed to prove through consistent action that I respected Ryan's privacy now, but Ryan also needed to work on being vulnerable enough to let me back in. She said trust wasn't just about me earning it back. It was about Ryan choosing to give it again even though I'd broken it. We both had homework after that session, ways we could practice being honest and respectful with each other. We had a setback the week after the couples session. Ryan mentioned his upcoming birthday during one of our dinner dates, and I instinctively asked if he was planning anything without me. My voice came out suspicious and hurt before I could stop it. Ryan got quiet and distant, his whole body language changing in a second. I realized immediately what I'd done, how I'd slipped back into old patterns of assuming exclusion meant deception. I tried to backtrack and explain that I just wanted to know if he wanted to celebrate together, but the damage was done. Ryan said this was exactly what he was afraid of, that I'd always have that edge of suspicion, and he'd always be defending himself against my trauma instead of just being trusted. We finished dinner in uncomfortable silence, and when Ryan dropped me off at home, he didn't kiss me goodbye. I sat in the driveway watching his truck disappear and hating myself for ruining a good moment with my stupid insecurity. I texted Ryan immediately, my fingers shaking as I typed out an apology. I explained that the question came out wrong, that it was just an automatic response from my old fears, not a real accusation. He didn't respond for 2 hours, and when he finally did, his message was short. He said we needed to talk in person. We met at the same coffee shop the next day, and Ryan looked tired, like he hadn't slept much. He told me this was exactly what he'd been afraid of, that I'd always have that edge of suspicion lurking beneath everything we did together. He said he didn't want to spend the rest of his life defending himself against my trauma, proving his innocence over things he never did. I promised him I was working on it, that I knew it was my problem to fix, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He said he wanted to believe me, but he needed to see real change, not just promises. We finished our coffee in silence, and he kissed my forehead before leaving, which felt both comforting and sad at the same time. The following week, we had another couples session scheduled, and I brought up the birthday incident right away. My therapist listened carefully, and then asked me to walk through exactly what I was feeling in that moment when Ryan mentioned his birthday. I admitted that my first thought was that he was planning something without me, and that automatically meant he was hiding something bad. She helped me see the pattern, how my brain jumped straight to worst-case scenarios without any evidence. She taught me a technique where I had to pause before speaking and ask myself 3 questions. First, what exactly did the person say? Second, what evidence do I have that supports my fear? Third, what other explanations could there be? We practiced it right there in the session with Ryan, going back through the birthday conversation and breaking it down step by step. Ryan watched me work through the exercise, and I could see something shift in his face, like maybe he was starting to believe I could actually change. The therapist gave me homework to practice this technique every single day, even with small things that didn't trigger me, so it would become automatic. I started carrying a small notebook where I wrote down my intrusive thoughts, and then worked through the 3 questions, and it helped me see how irrational most of my fears actually were. Ryan's birthday arrived 3 weeks later, and he texted me an invitation to celebrate at a bar downtown with Jake and some other friends. I felt nervous walking in because I knew these were the guys who'd heard about what I did, who probably thought I was crazy or toxic or both. The group was already there when I arrived, sitting around a big table with pitchers of beer and baskets of wings. Ryan stood up and hugged me when I got there, which felt like a good sign, but I could feel everyone else watching us carefully. Jake gave me a nod but didn't smile, and the other guys were polite but distant. I sat next to Ryan and tried to join the conversation, but I felt like I was on trial, like every word I said was evaluated. They told stories about their time in the service, and I listened, laughing when they laughed, trying to show them I respected that part of Ryan's life. One guy named Bryant asked me directly what I did for work, and I could tell he was testing me, seeing if I'd get defensive or weird. I answered honestly and asked him questions back, and gradually the tension started to ease a little. Ryan's hand found mine under the table at one point and squeezed, which made me feel like maybe I was doing okay. About an hour into the party, Jake stood up and motioned for me to follow him outside. My stomach dropped because I knew this was coming. the protective best friend talk. We walked out to the parking lot and Jake lit a cigarette, offering me one even though I don't smoke. He told me straight out that Ryan really loved me, but he'd been hurt badly, worse than Jake had seen him hurt by anything except Chelsea's death. He said Ryan talked to him almost every day during those weeks at his apartment, trying to figure out if he could trust me again. Jake said if I messed up one more time, there wouldn't be another chance, that Ryan would walk away for good and Jake would support that decision. I appreciated his honesty even though it scared me, and I told him I understood completely. I explained that I was in therapy twice a week now, that I was doing the work to fix my issues, and that I was committed to earning back everyone's trust, not just Ryan's. Jake studied my face for a long moment and then nodded, flicking his cigarette away. He said Ryan deserved someone who trusted him completely, and if I couldn't be that person, I needed to let him go before I hurt him worse. I promised Jake I could be that person, that I was becoming that person, and he clapped me on the shoulder before we walked back inside. 2 months after everything fell apart with the California trip, I had my regular Thursday therapy session, and something shifted. My therapist asked me to talk about my ex, really talk about him, not just mention him as the reason for my trust issues. I started describing the relationship, and suddenly I wasn't sad anymore. I was furious. I realized I'd been carrying this massive rage at being betrayed, at being lied to for 2 years, at being made to feel crazy when I questioned things. My therapist helped me see that I'd never actually processed that anger. I'd just buried it under fear and anxiety. She explained that I'd been directing all that rage at Ryan through my hypervigilance and control, making him pay for crimes he never committed. I sat there crying, but it felt different this time, cleaner somehow, like I was finally letting out poison that had been festering. My therapist said this was a breakthrough, that recognizing the anger was the first step to releasing it. She gave me an assignment for the next session that sounded strange, but I trusted her by then. The assignment was to write a letter to my ex, getting out every single thing I'd never said to him. My therapist told me I'd never send it, that this was just for me, a way to externalize all the hurt and betrayal I'd been carrying. I spent 3 days working on that letter, writing and rewriting, adding more every time I thought of something new. I wrote about how he made me doubt my own sanity, how he stole 2 years of my life with his lies, how he destroyed my ability to trust anyone. I wrote about the specific times I'd asked him if something was wrong and he'd looked me straight in the eye and lied. I wrote about finding out the truth and feeling like my whole reality had been fake. By the time I finished, the letter was 8 pages long and I felt exhausted but lighter. At my next session, my therapist read through it carefully and then asked me how I felt. I told her I felt angry still, but also sad for myself, for the girl who'd trusted so blindly. My therapist pulled out a small metal trash can and a lighter, and we ceremonially burned the letter together, watching the pages curl and blacken. She said this was me releasing that relationship's hold on me, choosing to let go of the rage so it couldn't poison my future anymore. I told Ryan about the breakthrough at our next weekly dinner, and I could see him really listening as I explained about finally processing my anger at my ex. I described burning the letter and what it felt like to watch those pages turn to ash, like I was finally free of something heavy I'd been carrying. Ryan watched my face the whole time I talked, and when I finished, he said he could see the difference in me, that I seemed lighter somehow, less afraid. He reached across the table and took my hand, lacing our fingers together, and it was the most intimate we'd been since before California. His thumb rubbed circles on the back of my hand, and neither of us said anything for a while, just sat there holding hands across the table. When the waiter came to take our order, Ryan didn't let go, and that small gesture meant everything to me. We talked through dinner about other things, normal things like work and his truck and a movie he wanted to see. It felt like we were finally getting back to being us, the couple we'd been before I ruined everything. After dinner, we walked around the parking lot for a while, not ready to say goodbye yet. Ryan stopped by his truck and turned to face me, his hands in his pockets. He told me he'd been thinking a lot about our future, about whether we could really make this work. He said he'd been talking to his therapist too, working through his own feelings about trust and vulnerability. Then he said something that made my heart skip, that he'd been thinking about moving back home. Not rushing back into everything like nothing happened, but starting to share space again, rebuilding our life together slowly. He said he wanted to keep doing therapy, both individually and as a couple, but he missed our life together, and he thought we'd both grown enough to try again. I started crying and he pulled me into a hug, holding me tight against his chest. I could hear his heartbeat and smell his familiar scent, and I realized how much I'd missed just being close to him. He said we'd take it slow, that he needed to feel secure before we went back to how things were before, but he was ready to try. We decided to spend a weekend together at the house as a trial run, to see how it felt being in the same space again. Ryan came over Friday night with an overnight bag, and it was both familiar and strange seeing him walk through the door like he used to. We ordered pizza and watched a movie on the couch, sitting close but not quite touching at first. Gradually, we relaxed into each other, his arm around my shoulders, my head on his chest, and it felt right. Saturday morning, we made breakfast together, moving around the kitchen in our old rhythm, and I realized how much I'd missed this simple domestic comfort. We spent the day doing normal couple things, running errands and working in the yard, and it felt good. But we were also more careful with each other, more intentional about checking in and communicating. When a small conflict came up about whose turn it was to do dishes, we handled it completely differently than we would have before. We both paused, talked through our feelings calmly, and found a solution without anyone getting defensive or hurt. Ryan noticed it too, commenting that we were actually better at handling disagreements now than we'd been when we thought everything was perfect. 3 months after Ryan moved out, he officially moved back in. We spent a whole evening setting up new boundaries and agreements before he brought his stuff over from Jake's place. We decided we'd both have full access to each other's phones, passwords shared openly, but we agreed not to check them unless there was a real reason. Ryan explained that he needed to know he could trust me to respect his privacy, and the only way to prove that was to have access, but choose not to use it. I understood what he meant, that trust was about choice, not surveillance. We also agreed to keep doing therapy, both together and separately, for at least another 6 months. We set up weekly check-ins where we'd talk honestly about how we were feeling, any concerns or worries, before they could build into bigger problems. Ryan brought over his clothes and personal items, and I helped him unpack, finding space in our closet and drawers. It felt significant, watching him hang his uniforms back up next to my dresses, like we were officially starting over but smarter this time. Our therapist pulled out a blank sheet of paper during our next session and asked what specific things we both needed to feel secure in the relationship moving forward. Ryan spoke first, saying he needed to know his phone and his private conversations were actually private, that I wouldn't check his messages without telling him first. I added that I needed to feel comfortable talking about my fears without being judged, that I could say when something triggered me without Ryan thinking I was accusing him of anything. We spent an hour working through each point, the therapist helping us turn vague feelings into concrete agreements we could both follow. Ryan said he'd share his location with me when he traveled, so I wouldn't worry, and I promised to tell him directly if something bothered me instead of letting it build up in my head. We wrote everything down together, both of us adding notes and crossing out phrases until we had something that felt right. The therapist made 2 copies and we both signed them at the bottom like a contract, which felt silly but also important somehow. Ryan folded his copy and put it in his wallet, and I stuck mine on our fridge with a magnet when we got home, right next to the grocery list and a photo of us from last summer. The next few weeks felt different in ways I couldn't quite name. We still did all the same things, cooking dinner together and watching TV on the couch and working in the yard on weekends, but there was this new awareness between us now. When Ryan's phone buzzed, I noticed how I didn't tense up anymore, didn't feel that spike of panic wondering who was texting him. He started telling me more about his day without me having to ask, sharing small details about work and his friends that he probably would have mentioned before, but now felt deliberate. We had our first real argument since he moved back in when I got annoyed that he left his dirty dishes in the sink. And instead of either of us getting defensive, we actually talked through why it bothered me and what we could both do better. It was such a small, stupid thing, but afterward Ryan said he was proud of how we handled it, and I realized he was right. Before everything fell apart, we probably would have just let it simmer until one of us exploded about something completely unrelated. Now we were actually dealing with problems when they were still small enough to fix easily. 4 months had passed since the day I accused him of cheating when Ryan brought up California over dinner one night. He was cutting into his chicken, and he said Maria had called him that afternoon asking about next year's memorial trip, wondering if he was still planning to come. My stomach dropped and I put down my fork, waiting for him to say he was going alone again. But instead he looked at me and said he told Maria he wanted to bring me eventually, that he still hoped I could meet her and see Chelsea's grave and understand that part of his life. He paused and then added that he needed to know I really understood how important that trip was, that it wasn't just a vacation or a casual visit, but something sacred to him and to Chelsea's memory. He said he couldn't handle me questioning it again, or doubting his reasons for going, that if I came with him next year, I had to trust him completely, about what the trip meant, and why certain things were done certain ways. I reached across the table and took his hand, telling him I understood now in a way I couldn't have before everything happened. I said I knew the trip was about honoring Chelsea and supporting Maria, and keeping his brother's memory alive with the people who loved him. I promised I would never question it again, would never let my own insecurity make me doubt something so important to him. I told him I'd be honored to meet Maria whenever she was ready to meet me, but I understood if she needed more time or if she never wanted me at the memorial. Ryan squeezed my hand and said he appreciated that, and he thought Maria would come around eventually, but she was protective of that day and the people who came to remember her son. I said I respected that completely, that some things were more important than my feelings, and this was definitely one of them. That night after we cleaned up dinner, I heard Ryan on the phone in the living room, his voice low and serious. I stayed in the kitchen putting away leftovers, giving him privacy even though I could hear parts of the conversation through the doorway. He was talking to Maria, and I heard him mention my name, heard him say something about therapy and how hard we'd both been working to fix things. There was a long pause where he just listened, and then he said he understood her concerns, but he really believed I was genuine about changing. Another pause, and then he laughed quietly at something she said, that warm sound he only made with people he really cared about. When he came back into the kitchen a few minutes later, he had this careful expression on his face, hopeful, but nervous. He told me Maria was willing to talk to me on the phone, that she wanted to hear from me directly about what happened and what I was doing to be better. My heart started racing, and I asked when, and Ryan said whenever I was ready, but probably sooner rather than later, so Maria didn't change her mind. I said I could call her this weekend if that worked, and Ryan nodded and pulled out his phone to text her. I spent the next week completely anxious about talking to Maria, rehearsing what I'd say, and then deciding it sounded too formal or too casual or too defensive. Ryan kept telling me to just be honest and let her see who I really was, but that almost made it worse because what if who I really was wasn't good enough? Saturday morning came and Ryan handed me his phone with Maria's contact already pulled up, and I took it into our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed staring at the call button. I finally pressed it before I could talk myself out of it, and Maria answered on the second ring with a warm hello that immediately made me want to cry. I introduced myself even though she obviously knew who I was, and there was this brief silence before she said she'd been hoping to hear from me. Her voice was kind, but there was something firm underneath it, like she was being nice, but she wasn't going to let me off easy. She asked how I was doing, and I said honestly that I was nervous to talk to her, that I knew I'd hurt Ryan badly, and by extension hurt her too. Maria made a small sound of agreement and said Ryan had talked about me constantly before the incident, that every phone call included some story about his girlfriend and how happy he was. She said she'd been excited to finally meet me this year, to put a face to all the stories and welcome me into their little memorial family. Then her voice changed slightly, and she said that excitement disappeared when Ryan called her from the airport, explaining why I wasn't coming, why he'd left early and alone. She told me Ryan cried on the phone with her, actually cried, which he never did even when talking about Chelsea. She said he felt betrayed and exposed and like he couldn't trust his own judgment anymore, and hearing him that broken made her angry at me even though she'd never met me. I apologized and started to explain about my ex, but Maria gently cut me off, saying she knew about my past and she understood trauma, but that didn't excuse what I'd done. She said Chelsea taught Ryan about loyalty and sacrifice, about standing by the people you love even when it's hard, and those values were core to who Ryan was as a person. When I accused him of cheating during the memorial trip, I didn't just hurt Ryan, I disrespected Chelsea's memory and everything that trip represented to their family and the other veterans who came to honor him. I felt tears running down my face, and I told Maria she was absolutely right, that I'd been so caught up in my own fear that I didn't think about what I was really accusing Ryan of. I said I understood now that the memorial wasn't just about Ryan visiting a grave. It was about keeping Chelsea alive through stories and friendship and love. I told her I was in therapy working on my trust issues and my trauma responses, and Ryan and I were in couples therapy learning to communicate better. I said I was trying so hard to be someone worthy of Ryan's trust again, someone who deserved to be part of his life and maybe eventually part of this memorial tradition. Maria was quiet for a long moment, and I thought maybe I'd said something wrong, but then she spoke and her voice was softer. She said she could hear that I was genuine, that I really understood the depth of what I'd done, and I was putting in real work to change. She said she was willing to give me a chance to prove myself over time, to show her and Ryan that I could be trusted with something as important as Chelsea's memory. Before we hung up, Maria said that if Ryan and I were still together and strong next year, I could come to California for the memorial trip. She wanted to see that we'd built something solid and healthy before she welcomed me into that sacred space, and I told her that was completely fair. I thanked her for even being willing to talk to me, for giving me a chance when she had every right to shut me out forever. She said Chelsea would have wanted her to be forgiving if someone was genuinely trying to be better, and she was going to honor that. After we said goodbye, I sat on the bed crying for a few minutes, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude, and the weight of knowing I had a whole year to prove I deserved this second chance. 5 months after everything fell apart, Ryan and I settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and completely new. We were still going to our individual therapy sessions every week and couples therapy every other week, working through issues as they came up instead of letting them pile up. I noticed how much better we were at talking about difficult things now, how we could have a conversation about something that bothered one of us without it turning into a fight or anyone shutting down. Ryan mentioned one evening that he'd been thinking about introducing me to some of his military friends beyond just Jake, people who knew Chelsea and would be at the memorial next year. I said I'd like that I wanted to understand that part of his life better and meet the people who meant so much to him. He smiled and said he'd set something up soon, maybe a barbecue or just dinner somewhere casual. A few weeks later, Ryan texted me one evening asking if I wanted to go for a drive. I said yes right away, and he picked me up after dinner, not telling me where we were going, but I trusted him now. We drove through town and into the older neighborhood near the library, and he pulled into the parking lot of the Veterans Park. I'd driven past this park 100 times but never really noticed it. Just another small green space with benches and trees. Ryan led me down a path toward the back corner, where a stone monument stood surrounded by American flags and memorial plaques. The monument listed names of local veterans who'd died in service, and Ryan stopped in front of one section, pointing to a bronze plaque with Chelsea's full name engraved on it. He stood there quietly for a moment and then started talking, telling me stories about Chelsea I'd never heard before. He told me about the time Chelsea got them both in trouble for sneaking extra rations to local kids near their base, how Chelsea could make anyone laugh even in the worst situations, how he taught Ryan to stay calm under pressure. Ryan's voice was steady, but I could hear the emotion underneath, and I just listened without interrupting, letting him share this part of his life with me. He told me about the day Chelsea saved his life, more details than he'd shared before, and I felt the weight of what that meant, how Ryan carried that debt and that grief every single day. We stood there for almost an hour while Ryan talked and I listened, and when he finally went quiet, I thanked him for bringing me here and letting me know his brother this way. Ryan squeezed my hand and said he wanted me to understand what Chelsea meant to him, why that California trip was so important, and I told him I did understand now and I'd never question it again. We walked back toward the parking lot slowly and sat on a bench near the entrance, the evening getting darker around us. Ryan turned to me and said he'd been thinking a lot about us and our future, and my heart started beating faster, but I stayed quiet and let him talk. He said he still wanted to marry me eventually. That hadn't changed, but he wasn't in a rush anymore. He wanted us to have more time being solid and healthy together, proving to ourselves and to Maria that we could handle hard things without breaking apart. I nodded and told him that made sense, that I wanted the same thing, to build something strong before we took that next step. Ryan said he needed to know we could communicate through problems instead of letting fear and suspicion take over, and I promised him I was committed to that, to being honest and trusting him even when my old fears tried to creep back in. We talked about therapy and how much it was helping both of us, how we were learning to handle conflict better and actually talk through issues instead of avoiding them. Ryan said Maria had noticed the change in him during their phone calls, that he seemed more settled and less angry, and she was starting to believe we might actually make it through this. I told Ryan I'd wait as long as he needed because he was worth it, worth all the work and the therapy and the uncomfortable conversations. I said I was grateful he gave me another chance when he didn't have to, when most people would have walked away after what I did. Ryan looked at me and said he almost did walk away, that he came really close to ending things, but something made him want to try. He said he kept thinking about all the good times we had before everything fell apart, how happy we were together, and he didn't want to lose that if there was any chance of getting it back. I felt tears in my eyes, but I didn't cry. Just told him I was committed to doing the work and building something better than what we had before. Ryan said he was committed too, to rebuilding trust and learning to be vulnerable again, even though it scared him. We sat there talking until the park lights came on, planning our future in a way we hadn't been able to before, being honest about what we needed from each other. We got up and started walking through the park together, holding hands like we used to, but it felt different now, more intentional. I felt genuinely hopeful about our future for the first time since California, like we'd been through the worst and came out stronger on the other side. Ryan stopped walking and pulled me close, and I leaned into him feeling safe and trusted in a way I hadn't felt in months. He said we were going to be okay, that it would take time but we'd get there, and I believed him. I knew now that I could trust Ryan completely, that he'd never given me a reason to doubt him, and I wouldn't let my past ruin what we were building. Ryan was learning to trust me again too, one day at a time, and I could see it in the way he looked at me now, like he was letting his guard down bit by bit. We walked back to his truck and drove home together, and for the first time in months, the silence between us felt comfortable instead of heavy.